Finding Pieces, we're looking at the popular genre on piano rolls. Now, I must confess, music of the popular genre of the 1900s is not something that I'm familiar with, but I can't let a season on piano rolls go without having at least an episode on this topic. Because as well as there being a demand for the classical repertoire on piano rolls, there was an equal, if not increasing demand for the popular genre over time. I'll begin with asking what is considered popular in the early 1900s. We will then spend the rest of this episode looking at the ragtime music style, which is considered America's first truly popular music style.
You're listening to Finding Pieces, a podcast on pianos, people, and music.
So what is considered popular? The term popular, or pop as we define it today, dates from around mid-1950s to loosely encompass songs which have rhythm or tempo that can be easily danced to. Catchy and repetitive melodies, usually verse-chorus structure, and borrow elements from styles such as rock, country, and dance. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term pop songs was first used in 1926, referring to music that have popular appeal, so music which were widely accessible and acceptable. If we look through the 1905 Aeolian Company's pianola catalogue, we see that actually the popular genre included the classical instrument genre and also the dance works. This does not really clarify what sets apart popular music as being a musical style as opposed to the classical music style. Let's continue to take a browse through the English title songs here. A quick search through the titles revealed that most of the songs come from Broadway or had appeared on Broadway. If we look into the difference between opera, vaudeville, musicals, minstrels, we compare principally the plot narrative, the lyrics, and the music, which includes composers, instrument musicians, and singers. Historically, after the Astor Place riot in New York City in 1849, there was amongst the public a perceived class segregation between the kinds of production entertainment. The riot was quite a serious event as about 22 to 31 people died and more than 120 were injured. It started with a dispute between two celebrities, a competition between a British actor and an American theatrical star to see who was the better one. This then triggered the tension between working-class British, Irish immigrants and their descendants and nativist Americans. This tension, a sense of hostility, still loomed around after the event. That opera was mainly for upper middle and upper classes, minstrel shows and melodramas for the middle class, variety shows and concert saloons for men of the working class and the slumming middle class. It was difficult to remove this taxonomy and stereotype, as firstly the storyline fueled on situations associated to their target audience, and secondly, musicians and singers employed to enact these productions range from those who did receive formal training and those who are amateurs. Over the next half-century, and by the start of the 1900s, most of these theatre productions moved towards a more literate form, high qualities of composing music, and a sophisticated way of staging, as well as a more receptive, welcoming venue which includes actors, singers, and musicians from less privileged cultures in America, the Black African Americans. So there was a shift, an upscaling of the musical skills in performances and productions of less elitism, and also an affluent mix of musical language from different cultures. Let's examine this thought in more detail by exploring how ragtime came to be popular in the United States between 1890s to the mid-1910s, and how piano rolls helped grow its popularity. How do we identify a ragtime style piece? Firstly, the title would usually say rag, and the act of ragging is to take a simple, conventional, and unsyncopated, so on the beat melody, break up its rhythm, and make it syncopated. over a rhythmic, steady bass. Ragtime compositions are usually in duple meter because by the early 1890s, the Americans were obsessed with march and two-step, which is essentially a march, which yielded a two-beat meter. At the heart of ragtime music is the folk and urban musical traditions of the Black African community in America. According to ragtime scholar William Sheffer, ragtime composers served as folk collectors, collection music in the air around them in the black communities and organizing it into brief suites or anthologies, which they call piano rags. Actually, this pattern of composers synthesizing folk song fragments within a larger scheme of composition was echoed in the UK as well as in Europe at around the same time. We can think of Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, and Frederick Dillius, as well as Edward Grieg. The difficulty for ragtime pioneers was that they had to work with music that is, in Sheffer's words, of a despised minority in an atmosphere considerably more hostile to artistic pretensions. The famous ragtime composer Scott Joplin emphasized that ragtime music had long existed but wasn't brought to public attention until the 1890s. Specifically, it was at the 1893 Chicago's World Fair, where rag was first exposed to an audience en masse. It was reported that 27 million people passed through the fair gates in those 6 months. 1895 saw the first publication of a ragtime composition, La Pa Ma La, by the minstrel comedian Ernest Hogan. Other successful ragtime compositions followed, starting with Ben Harney's song in 1896, which featured a banner proclaiming original introducer to the stage of the new popular ragtime. Then there were the piano rags by William Creel, Mississippi Rag in 1897, and then Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag appeared in 1899, and his Entertainer followed in 1902. As well as ragtime music being circulated through sheet music publications, there were itinerant pianist composers who traveled in the South and Midwest of America and eventually congregated mostly in Missouri, who made these compositions come to life. And this included Scott Joplin, Charles Hunter, Thomas Turpin, and many others. Performances and publishing of ragtime music then pushed the genre to the mainstream and increased its popularity in America over the next decade. The difference between ragtime compositions and other kinds of musical compositions which infuse the melodies and rhythms from the Black African culture, like cakewalks, is that ragtime is stalwartly pianistic and not really meant for dancing. And this is why ragtime music has such a strong foothold in the piano roll industry in the early 1900s. While the main method of disseminating rag music was through sheet scores, the technical demands of playing rag meant that some music publishers were reluctant to commit to marketing this music, which is beyond the ability of an average amateur, but may be frowned upon by the more serious, classically trained musicians. Despite ragtime's quick rise in popularity in the early 1900s, there was much condemning of this genre because of the music being heard and played in brothels and bars. Many of the ragtime and early jazz musicians were able to build and grow their pianistic skills and make a substantial living through working in these environments. For example, both Tony Jackson and Jelly Roll Morton started playing in brothels in their early teens. And Tom Turpine, the composer of Harlem Rag, was a self-taught pianist and, after the steps of his father, also owned a brothel by 1900. One can imagine how much commotion it would have caused. In the music monthly paper, The Etude, there was an article, Musical Impurity, which described ragtime as being a virulent poison. The counters of the music stores are loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic, it's finding its way into the homes and brains of the youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicion of their sanity. In 1901, the American Federation of Musicians in Denver forbid their members to play ragtime, encouraging them to make every effort to suppress and to discourage the playing and publishing of such musical trash. And this animosity towards ragtime continued, and at the same time, because it was being sold so well through piano rolls and played through player pianos, there was another negative criticism and stereotyping, and that ragtime compositions was unmusical and sounding very mechanical. In reaction to this, from 1910s and 20s, ragtime gradually fell out of favor, but it wasn't because it disappeared. It was because composers gradually stopped using the term ragtime.
This is 1917, this is October 1917. By this point, he's realised that ragtime has finished. So...
And also this is another typical pattern when a musical form such as ragtime reach maturity, they transform to become another musical form. So ragtime, rather than saying that it was replaced by, we should say that it was succeeded to the novelty piano style and then jazz. And unsurprisingly, the early traits of novelty piano style in the 1920s were very similar to the traits found in ragtime. Despite the animosity towards ragtime and their associated forms, ragtime was popular in America, but also influenced many of the European classical composers, again because of its mass exposure at another world exhibition across the Atlantic. For example, Claude Debussy's Goligot's Cakewalk in 1908 famously infuses the ragtime style. In Britain, the first public concerts of ragtime were performed by the American Ragtime Octet in 1912 at the Hippodrome in London. The octet's organizer was the ragtime composer and pianist Louis Muir, and the program included several of his composed rags. According to the historian Ian Whitcomb, they were the first American popular songs to influence British culture and music. Because ragtime as a musical form gradually dissipated from mid-1910s and by 1920s were anachronistic, and because recording for reproducing piano rolls did not take place in America until 1914-15, it meant that there really wasn't that much examples of pianists who recorded ragtime. Most of the clues as to how we play ragtime is by what Scott Joplin has said. There was a tendency to play fast in the early 1900s because since 1905, Joplin was known to print on his sheet music, "Do not play this piece fast. It is never right to play ragtime fast." Although what we conceived as fast may be a different speed to what Joplin may have thought. But what about the other contemporary ragtime pianists to Joplin? How fast did they play? Well, Mike Burnett, who was crowned by his fans as Ragtime King of the World in 1900, played with quite fluctuating speed. It was said in 1910 in the Chicago Daily Journal, upon hearing him play his Temptation rag, that he gives a piano-playing exhibition that looks like an acrobatic sideshow and sounds like a speeding pianola. Scott Joplin made 7 piano roll recordings for Conori's Music Company in 1916. I wish to spend a bit of time making some clarifications on the Scott Joplin rolls. A pianist recording on piano rolls, as I have explained in other episodes, is not a straightforward process. Most 88-note roll companies, and probably also true for Conori's music companies, used a marking or stenciling recording piano, which meant that as the pianist played, a roll of paper the master roll is marked with carbon and then had to be perforated by hand. So one can edit out the mistakes and make corrections over the carbon marking. It is likely true that Joplin did play the piano on the marking piano, but how much of what he played was edited out and corrected, we don't really know. According to the piano roll historian Douglas Henderson, all of the colorized rolls were actually cut and edited by the staff arranger, William Axelman. Robert Perry has made an analysis of these colorized Joplin rolls, and he concluded that they were extremely mathematically correct, equivalent to a sequence MIDI, as every crotchet quaver is lined up with the other notes in the chord. And so the note duration is exactly the same. By contrast, another of Joplin's piano roll recording for Uni-Record is not mathematically correct, which means that the colorized rolls were edited to conform to what was written on the score. Also, these rolls, the colorized Joplin rolls, were meant to be hand-played for expression by a pianolist on a player piano. We began the episode with a search of what is popular music in piano rolls, and this led us to an understanding of what popular appeal meant for the people in the 1900s in America. We looked at one musical style, the ragtime, and saw how it was advocated on piano rolls, and in turn how piano rolls advocated for its growing popularity as a music genre for a short span of time. We see that what is considered popular is transient, but the musical traits within that style, such as ragtime, continue to take shapes in forms not too dissimilar. In the next episode, we'll continue to look at what is the popular music style by looking at genres that continued after ragtime in the late 1910s and 20s. So, see you next time!